Hey guys, tonight we're wandering far from the cold stone of castles or the ink-splotched scriptoriums of the West. We're heading to a land where stories were not written but breathed. A land of rustling grasses, night winds, warm as oven bread, and a single voice rising beneath the wide-armed shadow of a baobab tree. Imagine the heat still radiating from the earth after sundown, the slow hush falling over the village as stew bubbles its last in the pot, and always someone clears their throat in that way that says a story's about to begin. Here, memory doesn't live in books. It lives in people. Griots, they're called. Men and women who didn't just tell stories, they were the stories. Living scrolls, if you like, though, more likely to tap their foot to a drum beat than shuffle paper. They carried the birth cries and battle screams of their people from ancestor to emperor, from dusty village trails to sprawling empires you've likely never heard of, unless you've spent your evenings reading old maps instead of sleeping, which, let's be honest, sounds exactly like something you do if you're here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere interesting under a blanket fort, in a tent, or in the dark quiet of a night shift, drop a comment. I like knowing where the stories go once I let them out. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the griot himself, or herself, though we'll get to that twist later. The griot sits on a low stool, spine upright, chin lifted as if the stars might ask him for a story. In some places he holds a kora, an instrument that looks like a harp and sounds like an argument between a waterfall and a lullaby. In others, he claps or taps a calabash, or simply lets his voice do the dancing. Whatever the form, his words come, slow rich, like honey left to warm in the sun. Now you might think, this is just storytelling, right? No, not quite. Storytelling is what we do when we're killing time or trying to make children sleep. Griots weren't about sleep. They were about history, law, gossip, and survival. They were historians, advisors, musicians, and social glue, all tied together with a sash and a deep sense of dramatic timing. And unlike your Aunt Margot, they couldn't get away with embellishing too much. Sure, there was room for a little flair. But the lineage of a king, the victories of an ancestor, the terms of a land agreement forged 147 years ago in the shade of a tree that may or may not still exist, that had to be right. Because if you got it wrong, you could be accused of reshaping reality, and some elders had very long memories and very short tempers. And here's your first reality check. If you think memorizing a 10-minute poem for school was hard, griots sometimes performed for hours, days. A griot in the Mande tradition might have memorized dozens of generations each with names, deeds, locations, birth omens, and usually at least one goat incident. Historians still argue whether this level of memory was enhanced by early training or just fueled by sheer social pressure and strong millet beer. But what we do know is this griots were revered and slightly feared. Like that one elderly neighbor who knows everything about everyone and carries a wooden spoon like it's part of a ritual. You wouldn't invite a griot to your wedding without careful planning. You certainly wouldn't interrupt one mid-story. And heaven help you if you ever tried to challenge one's version of history in public. There are tales of chieftains who dared and ended up thoroughly embarrassed with a tale about their great-grandfather's mystical trousers, retold just loud enough for the entire village to hear. And yet griots weren't cold archivists. Their stories breathed. They had rhythm. They came with the crack of the fire, the occasional dramatic cough, and the kind of eye contact that made you feel like your ancestors were judging your posture. In the beginning, there was no written script. Not because people didn't care to write, but because writing didn't yet carry the soul of the thing. Ink couldn't sing, paper didn't sway. Memory, when told right, lived with you. It moved in like an eccentric uncle, rearranged your mental furniture, and left a few puzzling proverbs behind. And that's what the griot did. He or she would sit beneath the same tree year after year, and by firelight, by starlight, by sheer force of tradition, carry the past into the present with nothing but voice breath and the occasional dramatic pause. So here we are beneath that same tree in your mind. The stew smells faintly of peanut, and maybe, is that goat again? The fire crackles, the air hums, the villagers lean in, and the griot begins. The griot's voice carries through the night past the listening ears and closed eyes of children pretending not to fall asleep, past the elders leaning on carved canes and nodding with each familiar name. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we tumble too deep into this world of remembered kings and whispered betrayals, let's take a step back, yes, carefully. Mind the stew pot and look at the bigger picture. West Africa, before the arrival of colonial hats and clipboards, was an intricate tapestry of kingdoms, empires, and villages, many with names that sound like music if you say them slow enough. Mali, Songhai, Ghana, but not the modern one with traffic jams and Instagram, the ancient Ghana, where gold dust paid for salt. And salt was worth more than your cousin's fancy sandals. These were societies without the printing press, without bookshelves or filing cabinets, and yet, astonishingly, they remembered everything, or at least everything worth remembering. See, there were no diaries, no tweets, no receipts to wave around when your cousin swore he never borrowed your ox. There was only the griot. He remembered who owned what land, who had married whom, which ancestor insulted which ancestor's mother during the yam festival, and whether that feud still technically counted. The griot didn't just tell stories, he kept order. When two families quarreled, it was often the griot who stepped in, reminding everyone that back in the third generation, their great-great-grandfathers had once shared a calabash of beer during a thunderstorm, and that surely counted for something. In this memory, it wasn't scribbled in margins or whispered behind backs. It was performed with rhythm, with style, sometimes with drums that thudded like heartbeats and words that leapt and spun like dust devils in the dry season. A good griot could hold your attention for hours. A great one could make you forget your legs were asleep and you were sitting on a rock shaped like an awkward question. Of course, even the most majestic griot had to start somewhere, and that somewhere usually involved drums dust and dubious memories. Apprenticeship began early. A child born into a griot family might first learn to talk by repeating the names of ancient kings, not nursery rhymes. Instead of singing about little goats on hills, they'd be memorizing the death cries of generals. It wasn't unusual for a 6-year-old to be able to chant their entire family lineage backward while chewing on a mango pit. This training wasn't casual, it was intense. Long hours, reciting under the sun, practicing tone, rhythm, and expression, because a flat retelling of a royal romance was considered worse than forgetting it entirely. If your voice didn't swoon where it needed to swoon, or thunder, When it should have roared, you could expect an elder to toss a pebble at your head and demand you try again, this time with feeling. And then there were the drums. Ah, yes, the drums. Not just background noise, but co-narrators, partners in timekeeping, mood setting, and occasionally discipline. It's said that some griot schools taught memory through percussion. A mistake in recitation would result in a dramatic shift in rhythm, like a musical slap on the wrist. If you've ever had a teacher clap slowly at you in disappointment, you're starting to understand the vibe. Now, some historians argue endlessly, I might add, about whether the griots used systems of symbolic memory like ancient mnemonic maps or encoded gestures. Others insist it was sheer repetition and familial tradition. And then there's the fringe theory involving fermented honey drinks and dream memory, which, while delightfully strange, remains mostly unprovable and slightly sticky. But whatever the truth, the result was, the same griots who could hold the pulse of a people in their heads, from empires long crumbled into dust to marriages sealed with little more than a knowing glance and a past calabash of beer. Of course, not everything they remembered was noble. Griots were also the keepers of gossip, petty rivalries, awkward nicknames, the time someone's uncle got too friendly with a camel and had to leave the village for a while. They knew where the bodies were metaphorically buried, and occasionally where the real ones were too. This gave them power, not the sword-wielding kind, but the eyebrow-raising kind. The I know what you did during the harvest festival 5 years ago, and if you don't pass me the goat meat, I might suddenly remember it in verse kind. There are stories, some confirmed, some whispered, of griots being bribed to forget, to edit, to reframe. And while most griots prided themselves on integrity, let's not kid ourselves. If history is a stew, a griot sometimes chose which ingredients to emphasize and which unfortunate onions to leave out. Still, the heart of it was truth, or something close enough to truth that it carried the weight of memory and the blessing of ancestors. Because if you could remember a thing well enough, long enough, deeply enough, it became truth. Not because it was accurate in the modern sense, but because it was believed, repeated, and lived through generations. And so the griot's voice wove through time a thread that pulled the past into the present, without ink or stone, just breathbone and the soft beat of a drum beneath the stars. So now we've seen the griot fully grown, performing under stars, holding court with kings and commoners alike. But even the most majestic teller of tales had a beginning. And let me tell you, it wasn't all poetry and praise songs. No, before a griot could make elders nod and nobles weep, they were like so many of us, just some unfortunate child trying not to fall asleep during a very long lesson. That's where the boy with an elephant's memory comes in. Of course, he didn't start with such a memory. No one does. It's not like griot babies are born quoting proverbs and listing dynasties in chronological order. But in the stories told by griots about other griots, and yes, they absolutely did this, griots love a good story about themselves. There's always that one boy, wide-eyed and quiet, sitting on a reed mat as his uncle chants the genealogy of 7 villages in a row. And does the boy drift off? Not quite. Not unless he wants to be gently swatted with a string of beads, or worse, publicly corrected by his own younger cousin. See, training as a griot was equal parts inspiration and intimidation. They didn't just train memory, they tested it like an old stew, poke it, prod it, leave it overnight, test again in the morning? The lessons began small. Remember the names of your family, then your neighbors, then the extended lineage of a nearby nobleman's maternal aunt, including the man she almost married before the rainy season flood of 1739, but didn't, and why. Before long, the boy had to recall these things, not just in list form, but as part of narrative. It's not enough to say Amadou begat Sori, who begat Kadiatu. You had to remember why Sori quarreled with his brother during the yam harvest, and how Kadiatu's marriage to a trader from the river town helped heal the family rift. Until the goat went missing, of course, but that's another tale. To the untrained ear, griot training might sound like an oral equivalent of being buried under an avalanche of names, dates, and decisions made under questionable influence. And it was truly. But it was also deeply musical, because the griot didn't memorize by rote. He memorized by rhythm. This is where the kora came in, the stringed instrument that sounded like heaven's harp had gone wandering. As the apprentice recited, the teacher would play. A mistake would mean a sudden sour note or the rhythm stalling like a mule mid-crossing. It trained the mind to associate memory with movement, cadence, and vibration. Over time, the boy's brain became like a honeycomb of memory paths. One image triggered another. A rhythm unlocked a name. A taste or smell called forth a proverb. And yes, perhaps a good helping of millet beer helped during those tougher lessons. Now there were tricks, of course. The brain, even in hot climates, loves a good shortcut. One common technique involved linking historical figures with animals. Dimba, the crocodile, wasn't just a metaphor for someone slippery. He probably had a crocodile at some point, or at least claimed he once stared one down during a fishing trip. Aminata the bee stung people with her words. Kuyate the goat. Well, let's not dwell too much on why that stuck. And then there were physical gestures. A hand raised slightly could indicate a change in lineage. A glance to the left meant a tale of betrayal. A pause, a breath. And the storyteller could signal a shift from praise to satire without ever saying so aloud. Some elders even trained their apprentices in what can only be described as performative memory, where a slight tilt of the head or drumbeat shift changed the entire meaning of a tale. You think emoji use is nuanced? Try understanding history through eyebrow lifts and foot taps. Still, historians continue to squabble about how it all worked. Was it genetic, a family thing? Was there some secret mnemonic device no one ever recorded because griots didn't write things down? One academic once proposed that griots used scent to aid memory, sprinkling certain herbs or spices to mark sections of a story. Another suggested memory was embedded in the geography of the village, each hut or tree representing a moment in time. Of course, a rival academic rolled his eyes and pointed out that it was probably just decades of practice and no small amount of family pressure. Either way, both agreed. Trying to test a griot's memory was like trying to challenge the moon to a staring contest. And yet it wasn't all rigidity. Apprentices were also taught when to embellish. Not what to embellish that was strictly regulated, but when. A boring wedding story. At a thunderstorm. A tale of betrayal sprinkle in a proverb about hyenas and trust. The truth remained, but the drama, oh, that was a gift. Eventually the boy would stand alone before the village tasked with telling the tale of a long-dead ancestor who once fell asleep during a royal ceremony and woke up governor of a province. It would be his test. The fire would flicker, the elders would squint, the goats, always goats, would bleat in the background. And if he remembered it all, if his rhythm held and his pauses carried meaning, he'd pass. If not well, he'd get another few years of stew-stained scrolls and second chances. After all, even the greatest griot started by forgetting something important and being publicly mocked for it. A rite of passage, really. It's often said that you remember what you love and more frequently what embarrasses you horribly in public. But griots, as we've established, remembered more than just the highs and humiliations. They remembered everything. And curiously, a good portion of that everything came served with a bowl of stew. Now you might wonder what goat stew has to do with oral history. And to that I say everything, my friend. Because history doesn't live in silence. It lives in context. In the aroma of crushed peanuts simmering with chunks of meat. In the sizzle of oil heated over a fire made from termite-resistant wood. In the way stories unfold after the eating begins when bellies are full and guards are down. See, in many West African communities, stories didn't start when everyone sat in rows like obedient school children. They began in the cooking, the chopping, the humming, the stew. In many cases was the prelude, a simmering overture that said, "Ah, something is coming." A good griot knew this. He didn't just tell tales. He cooked the memory into the evening. The smell of stew, wafting through the compound, primed the listeners. It settled their minds. It let them anticipate not just the food, but the feast of meaning to come, because nobody listens properly on an empty stomach, except goats, and goats can't be trusted. There's even an old saying, a story told before the stew is served is like a dance done without drums. In other words, it might technically work, but you'll look ridiculous and nobody will remember it fondly. So yes, stew mattered. Not because it was ceremonial, but because it anchored the moment. And every griot worth his salt or his ground chili knew how to layer meaning into that moment. A certain spice might be used when telling the tale of a wedding. A certain bitter leaf might accompany stories of betrayal. One griot was said to stir the pot in rhythm with his chants, each swirl aligning with a lineage, every bubble a reminder of time passing. Now, some historians scoff at this, of course. They claim that the stew was just stew and the stories were separate. But these are the same historians who've never tried remembering 60 generations of genealogy while mildly hungry and surrounded by impatient villagers. It's easy to be academic when your subject matter isn't also your dinner. But to the griots, food and memory were woven together, like braids in the hair of history, if you will. The apprentice might not recall a tricky name, but he might remember that it came just as the onions hit the fire, or that a particular ancestor always came up right after the okra was added, a slimy yet unforgettable detail. And then there's the ritual of sharing. A griot did not sit above the people like some aloof scholar. He sat with them. He ate with them. His words were not precious artifacts. They were nourishment like the stew. Heavy with history, thick with meaning, spiced with a little side-eye. Occasionally, a griot might pause mid-tale to accept another scoop, nodding solemnly as if the taste reminded him of an uncle's betrayal 3 generations back. And sometimes he wasn't bluffing. Now, not all stews were equal. Some were rich and savory, thick with meat and ground nuts. Others, especially during lean seasons, were more aspirational water with a personality. But even these had their place in memory. One griot famously recited a famine-era poem so vividly that his listeners swore they could taste dust and regret in their mouths for weeks. And the goats. Oh, the goats. Somehow they're always in the background. Never the stars of the story, but often the turning point. A miscounted dowry, a runaway goat during a chieftain's naming ceremony, a stubborn creature that ate half of an ancestral drum and was, for reasons never fully explained, forgiven and later honored with a song. Whether as food metaphor or divine nuisance, goats threaded through the griot's memory like mischievous punctuation marks. But the real magic was this stew made memory tangible. It created moments. And griots were not simply repositories of data, they were architects of moments. They used all the senses to cement stories. The pop of a seed in oil, the crackle of fire, the sigh of someone biting into a too-hot yam. These were cues, anchors, memory pegs, if you like, pounded into the walls of time with the pestle of daily life. So yes, to an outsider, a griot's memory might seem miraculous. But from the inside it was built piece by piece, bite by bite. A string of details tied together not with ink, but with sound, scent, and stew. There's even a legend, half whispered, half sung, about a griot so attuned to flavor that he could predict a lineage based on the seasoning in the broth. Salt too sharp must be the family of Sadio the Harsh, a mellow, slow heat, surely the descendants of Binta the Kind. And if the stew burned, well, some stories are better not told, at least not without a spoon. So next time you smell something simmering, think of the griots. Think of stories steeped in spice, of memory thickened like sauce left to rest. And maybe you'll understand that history isn't just what we remember. It's how we remember it. And sometimes it smells faintly of roasted ground nuts and a dash of pepper. Now, if you've made it this far without forgetting what we're talking about, congratulations, you're already halfway to being a griot yourself. But before you start composing your neighbor's ancestral praise song, let me introduce you to one of the more daunting tasks a griot had to face: the names. Oh, the names. Names that piled on top of names like laundry on a market day. Names with more syllables than a tired goat has bleats. Names that carried not just identity, but entire lifetimes wrapped tightly in layers of metaphor. Titles, spiritual references, and occasionally deeply awkward nicknames that somehow became part of the official record. Because you see, griots didn't just recite Ali son of Musa. No, they would say Ali son of Musa, the watchful grandson of Saidu, the rain chaser of the house that survived the great dry season, who once traded salt for a camel that ran away. And that's just the polite version. In full ceremonial mode, they might include birth signs, notable deeds, favored drum rhythms, and an aside about that time Ali fell in a well and pretended it was on purpose. Each person in a lineage carried a bundle of identity that was far too precious and far too entertaining to reduce to just one name. So griots layered them like onions, fragrant, tear-inducing onions of memory. An outsider might hear these and wonder, is all of this necessary? To which the answer is absolutely not, but it's essential. Because in a world without written contracts, paper family trees, or Facebook related to tabs, the depth of these names was the proof. They were credentials, evidence, social security insurance resume, and spiritual passport all rolled into one and delivered with theatrical flair. It wasn't uncommon for a griot to begin a story with a name so long that the stew went cold before he finished. But no one complained, because to interrupt the lineage was to interrupt existence. To cut short a name was to risk cutting short your own place in history. And these weren't names pulled from a hat. They were memorized, in order, with variations depending on audience and context. If the person being honored had recently insulted the griot's cousin, for example, a few less flattering names might accidentally slip in. Ah, yes, Mamadou the Wide-Eyed. Also known as Mamadou who could not cook millet even once. Slip of the tongue, of course. Training in names was a discipline all its own. Some griot apprentices were assigned entire name clusters to memorize matrilineal lines, patrilineal lines, cousin disputes, adoption, footnotes, and more. All spoken with clarity, rhythm, and occasionally the resigned sigh of someone who just remembered yet another cousin twice removed who insists he belongs in the tale. Some griots even developed voice maps. Shifts in pitch or tone might indicate a change in lineage. A sudden flourish might denote nobility. A pause weighted and slow could mean that the name being uttered once saved a village or alternately once insulted a spirit by sneezing in the wrong direction. Historians still argue whether the griots relied solely on memory or whether some had secret coded systems, beads, carved staffs, or musical cues that jogged the mind. There's tantalizing evidence griots who carried staffs with symbols carved deep into the wood, claiming they just liked the feel of it, but whose stories always flowed smoother when the staff was nearby. Coincidence or mnemonic sorcery? We'll never know, because griots were famously closed-lipped about their methods. You could beg, flatter, offer the finest stew with the tenderest goat chunks, and still the griot would just smile and say, "Ah, memory flows where the drum calls," which is either very profound or complete nonsense, depending on how sleep-deprived you are. And then there's the infamous name duels. Yes, those were real. In some regions, when disputes over lineage arose, say, during a wedding negotiation or a land claim, two griots might stand up and begin reciting the names, each tracing the family trees back generation by generation, like dueling genealogists armed only with lungs and pride. One griot would chant, "Geneba, daughter of Kofi, the swift son of Amara, the fisher who married Aminata the eagle-eyed," to which the other would thunder, "False Amara, first wed Dogo the stubborn's niece. He only married Aminata after the millet harvest," and so on. The audience, caught between amusement and mild concern, would murmur and nod. Sometimes bets were placed, sometimes the dispute ended in laughter, sometimes in stew throwing, once allegedly in a spontaneous interpretive dance-off. The historical record is unclear, but the point is names mattered deeply. To forget a name or worse, mix it up, was more than a simple mistake. It was an insult, a historical erasure. A griot caught doing this too often could lose their standing, their audience, even their dinner invitations, which, to be clear, was the real punishment. So when you hear a griot unfold a name like a tapestry, don't roll your eyes. Listen. Feel the rhythm. Hear the life tucked inside each syllable. Imagine the generations stacked behind each one like worn stones in a village wall. And remember, the next time someone mispronounces your name at a party, you could always respond with 45 minutes of ancestral exposition and see how they like it. By now you're probably wondering what exactly were these griots remembering with such fierce devotion. Sure, lineages, titles, long-winded names that could knock out a goat from boredom. But what else? What stories did they carry in those tireless tongues? Well, some of the tales were grand epics of empires, conquests, and spirits called down from baobab trees with no sense of personal space. But many stories, many were glorified gossip with royal consequences. And this brings us to the prickliest, juiciest branch of the griot's repertoire, the tangled thicket of birthrights, betrayals, and scandalous great aunts. You see, in West African societies, especially within the great kingdoms like Mali Songhai and the smaller but feisty Jolof states. Your claim to land status goats and the right to sit under the shady tree during market day, these were all rooted in ancestry. And who knew the ancestry? Who decided whether your grandmother was in fact the second wife, or merely the woman who cooked a lot and stayed over too often? The griot. One misplaced word, one forgotten cousin, and boom, you're no longer heir to anything but disappointment and a goat with a limp. There's an old tale, possibly true, certainly delicious, about a young noble preparing for marriage. Everything was perfect. Dowry, arranged families, thrilled stew bubbling, until the griot stood to chant the lineage of the groom and casually mentioned a previously unspoken union between the groom's grandfather and the bride's mother's cousin. Silence, followed by frantic whispering, followed by someone dramatically dropping a calabash. The wedding was called off, the stew was angrily redistributed, and the bride ended up marrying a quiet merchant who owned 3 canoes and exactly 0 problematic relatives. This is why griots had to be exact, not just entertaining, correct. Their words held political weight. Their memory shaped marriages, treaties, and land disputes. Forgetting a mistress's cousin's scandalous affair wasn't just a storytelling hiccup, it could spark a lawsuit. Or worse, a duel. In fact, some griots were so feared for their memory that local nobles kept them close, not out of affection, but pure self-preservation. If your griot liked you, your family history sparkled like polished bronze. If your griot felt underappreciated or, heaven forbid, underfed, you might find yourself remembered slightly, differently. Ah yes, Samba the Brave. Also known as Samba the repeatedly defeated but very good at retreating. The griot's knowledge of royal lines extended back centuries. They could recount which cousin took offense at which wedding toast in the rainy season of 1431, and how that eventually led to the creation of an entirely separate village out of spite. Historians still argue about how griots maintained this scandal-layered memory. Some claim it was communal, that griots often convened to double-check stories and cross-reference family drama like a group of medieval librarians who occasionally burst into song. Others think it was part magical thinking, part training. The ability to see the family tree not just as a series of names, but as a living drama with faces, sounds, and goat-related turning points. And then, of course, there's the oral tradition of verbal shielding. You see, sometimes stories were too delicate to tell outright. A griot might say, "In those days the moon turned its face away, and one house grew 3 shadows where only 2 were welcome." This, to the trained ear, meant someone slept where they shouldn't have, and a child was born who complicated inheritance law for the next 30 years. But to outsiders it sounded poetic, beautiful, mysterious, which was exactly the point, unless you think it was all shade and scandal. Let's remember that griots also told stories of heroism, of reconciliation, of unlikely friendships between rival bloodlines that began when 2 children shared roasted maize during a dust storm. These stories reminded people not just of who they were, but of who they could be. Still, nothing got the crowd going quite like a well-timed whisper about an ancestor who traveled too far on a borrowed horse or spoke honey in the ears of 3 sisters in one season. It's said that a griot in the Segu region once caused an entire chieftaincy council to burst into laughter and resign just by recounting the true circumstances of a mysterious uncle's disappearance and a jealous yam vendor. There was danger too. Speak ill of the wrong ancestor, and you might find yourself chased out of the village. Speak too truthfully about a powerful family's less flattering history, and the consequences could be worse. One griot famously exiled for recalling a queen's forgotten engagement to her goat-herding tutor is said to have found refuge in a neighboring kingdom where he promptly became their favorite historian. Because memory, especially when performed aloud, is power. A griot's tongue could lift up or unravel a legacy, and they knew it. So the next time you find yourself tangled in your own family tree, unsure if that cousin is your third or fourth, or just someone who keeps showing up at reunions, remember the griots? They did this for hundreds of people, backwards, in rhyme, while hungry, and sometimes during sandstorms. And they rarely forgot. Now, if you've been lulled into a gentle respect for the sheer elegance and discipline of the griot's memory, allow me to jolt you back to reality with a tale of what happens when that memory takes a creative detour. Picture this: a full moon rising over the village. The fire burns low, casting long shadows across the compound. The stew has been eaten. The crowd, bellies full and eyelids heavy, leans in. And the griot, seasoned, solemn, dressed in flowing cloth, begins a tale they've told 100 times before. But tonight, for reasons no one fully understood, though the fermented millet drink might have played a role, the griot decided to improvise. Not much. Just a tiny tweak here, a nudge there. Perhaps the great ancestor rode a lion instead of a horse. Perhaps the queen defeated the invaders with only her voice and a sharp stick. Perhaps, just perhaps, the goat didn't eat the sacred drum. It was a jealous cousin who blamed the goat. Now, ordinarily, the audience might chuckle. They'd indulge the drama, the flair. After all, who doesn't love a good twist? But something felt off. The elders stiffened. A child whispered, "That's not how Auntie told it." And somewhere out in the dark beyond the firelight, the wind changed. A pot cracked. The griot's voice faltered. Because in the griot tradition, stories aren't just stories. They are truths, wrapped in memory, passed down with precision. Changing them carelessly, even for the sake of drama, wasn't innovation. It was heresy. A griot could embellish, yes. They could add color, flavor, the seasoning of performance. But the spine of the tale, the sequence, the message that had to stay true. Because these weren't just tales for entertainment, they were history, law, identity. The ancestors, it was believed, listened. And if you twisted their stories too far, they might respond with something subtle. A dry season that lasted a little too long. A child who couldn't sleep. A goat that screamed like a man in the night. It happened once, or so they say. There's a legend of one griot who tried to reshape a dynasty's origin story, cutting out the shameful parts, polishing the rest. The crowd applauded, the nobles cheered. But that night thunder cracked without clouds. The cooking pot split. The village chickens marched in a circle and refused to lay eggs for a week. Historians still argue whether this actually happened or if it was just a particularly elaborate metaphor about the dangers of historical revisionism. But in the griot circles, the message was clear: the stories are not yours. You do not own them, you carry them like water in a calabash, and you do not spill. Still, the temptation to tweak was always there. Every griot had their moment. A night when the crowd was too silent, the nobles too distracted, the drum too slow. And in that silence, the griot might think, what if I just add a little thunder, slightly more glorious ending? Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And occasionally the goats would get involved, because of course they would. There was a griot in the upper Niger region who famously tried to insert a tale of a talking goat who advised kings. It was meant to be metaphor, obviously, but the story caught on, children loved it, traders repeated it, and before long the goat had eclipsed the actual ancestor. To this day in that village, you can buy carvings of the wise goat, the real king reduced to a footnote. The griot in question was not banished, but he was politely asked to perform only fishing songs for the next 5 years. The problem, you see, is that stories, especially oral ones, live. They breathe. And like any living thing, they can misbehave. They can grow in odd directions. If not tended carefully, they become myths, wearing the clothes of history. And the griots knew this, so they developed internal rules, oral footnotes, if you will, ways to signal to the listener. This part is flexible, that part is fixed. Listen closely now. This is where the truth begins again. A shift in tone, a drumbeat pause, a flick of the eyes toward the fire. These cues mattered. Because the griot wasn't just a performer, they were a librarian without a building, a historian without a book, a memory keeper walking the tightrope between truth and poetry. The elders kept them honest. One could never stray too far without a sharp look or a muttered correction from a white-bearded woman who remembered things better than any man ever would admit. And so the griot learned balance. To tell with flair but not fiction. To entertain but not fabricate. To respect the sacred weight of each tale even as they let it dance. Because stories, once told, do not belong to the teller anymore. They ripple outward. They settle in the hearts of children. They get repeated during funerals, whispered at weddings, chuckled over during long treks to market. And sometimes, only sometimes, they get remembered wrong. A name misheard, a date misplaced, a goat that didn't actually talk, but someone swears it did. And when that happens, the griot sighs, tightens the cloth around their waist, and begins again. From the beginning, as it truly happened. Or close enough. Now that we've established how dangerous it is to lie about goats or invent talking livestock, let's step quietly into one of the more mysterious corners of the griot's world, the memory palace. No, not a literal palace, though, if you're picturing a sandstone courtyard filled with whispering ancestors and the smell of roasted millet, you're not far off. A memory palace for the griot wasn't built from stone. It was built from images, from paths walked so often in the mind that they became as real as any hut or drum or elder's stare. In the West, ancient philosophers like Cicero talked about this method: walk an imaginary house in your head, and in each room place a thing you need to remember. A banana for your first point, a lion in the kitchen for your second, a terrifying X in the hallway for that awkward legal clause. The griots, though, didn't build their memory palaces out of marble. They built them out of mango trees and rivers. And that one market lady with the very sharp elbows and an endless supply of gossip. It was a geography of memory tied to the land, alive, seasonal, sometimes smelly. Take, for instance, the mango grove. To a griot, each tree might represent a generation. The bend of a trunk might recall a cousin who moved away. After a failed yam harvest romance, a twisted root might signal a feud, a patch of bitter herbs at the base. A betrayal that took 3 weddings to fix. The path itself mattered. A walk from the village square to the fishing hole could carry dozens of historical references. Here is where the great chief met the river spirit. Here is where the second wife of the third elder tripped on a turtle, and changed inheritance law forever. You didn't just remember events, you remembered places, and the stories tied to them followed naturally like dust trailing a traveler's feet. Even children learned this. An apprentice might be sent to fetch water from the far well, not because anyone needed the water, but because that path included the mental markers for a particularly dense section of clan history. Take the left path past the termite mound, the elder might say, and remember to recite the names of the rulers of the Horse Reign dynasty as you walk. If you forget one, you walk back. By the time they return, they might not remember why they were carrying a leaky gourd, but they'd absolutely remember that Damba the Short reigned for only 2 weeks before being dethroned by a donkey-related incident. Historians debate whether this spatial mapping was taught or simply absorbed. Some believe griots used carefully coded objects, a line of beads, the folds of a cloth, even the placement of musical notes on a drumskin to hold information. Others believe the entire system was communal layered knowledge passed down not just from teacher to student, but reinforced by villagers' events and even weather. There's one particularly charming story, possibly exaggerated, definitely delightful, of a griot who mapped an entire region's history onto the layout of his garden. The tomatoes represented warriors, the peppers birthrights. A slightly cursed eggplant was assigned to a family scandal involving twins, mistaken identity, and a giraffe. Guests were not allowed to pick from this garden without permission. One unfortunate visitor plucked a pepper without asking, and the griot reportedly refused to speak to him for 3 days, claiming he'd just eaten the third battle of Tambaga. But perhaps the strangest and most enchanting form of memory involved scent. Now, this isn't confirmed by modern science. You won't find it in textbooks. But in some regions, griots would scent their hands or garments with particular herbs while telling certain stories. Basil for lineage, lemongrass for reconciliation, bitter cola for betrayal. Whether this was mnemonic or symbolic or just a delightful superstition, we can't say. But villagers swore they could smell the story coming before the words even arrived. It wasn't always metaphorical. One griot, known only as Grandfather Saliu, was said to carry tiny satchels of dried leaves under his sleeves. During tense moments in the tale, he'd squeeze one, subtly releasing just a hint of scent into the air. His audience, lulled by rhythm and firelight, would inhale and feel the shift like stepping from sun into shade. Was this memory? Was it performance? Was it slightly herbal mind control? Yes, probably. Because griots weren't just reciters of facts, they were curators of experience, and they knew that memory isn't just mental, it's physical. It lives in scent, sound, space, sensation. A griot's story wasn't just something you heard, it was something you walked through, something that clung to your clothes and followed you home. There's a reason why, even today, when griots perform in cities and on stages, they still pause, still breathe, still invoke the world of the memory palace. Even if the mango trees are gone, even if the termite mound was paved over for a gas station, the mental paths remain, the stories walk themselves, and you, if you've been listening closely, might feel it too. A smell, a rhythm, a sense of walking through a world that doesn't exist anymore, but somehow still lingers in the corners of your mind, like a garden, like a grove, like a story you once heard, long ago, under a mango tree. So we've wandered the memory gardens, walked the dusty trails of imaginary mango groves, and sniffed the air of stories steeped in basil and betrayal. But now it's time to get to the heart of what really made the griot's memory tick rhythm. Not just any rhythm, mind you, not the plodding beat of a tired drummer at a cousin's third wedding. This was the heartbeat of history, the thrum of collective memory. A rhythm that lived in the voice, the drum, the breath between words, and the space where silence becomes as meaningful as a shout. Because griots didn't just remember, they sang memory, they chanted it, they danced it with their tongues. Their minds were metronomes trained over years of repetition, improvisation, and sharp side eyes from their teachers if they drifted off beat. Rhythm was the griot's secret map through the dense forest of history. And if you followed it, you never got lost. Let's start with the drum. The djembe, the tama, the talking drum, each one an instrument not just of music, but of mnemonics. These drums weren't just played to accompany a story. They were part of the story's structure. A certain beat might signal a shift from one dynasty to another. A pause in the rhythm could mean a change in tone from praise to satire, from mourning to laughter. If the griot was skilled, and they usually were, unless they'd skipped too many mango path memory drills, the rhythm itself was telling you something before a word had been spoken. There's a particular tale of a griot who lost his voice during a long drought. Dust in the throat, you understand. Instead of canceling the evening's performance, he simply gestured to his apprentice to begin drumming. And then, for over an hour, he told an entire war story with rhythm alone, drum beats, rising, falling, stuttering, in fear, charging in anger, finally slowing into a solemn funeral cadence. The audience wept. Some historians scoff, of course. Surely they were just moved by the idea, they say. Maybe. Or maybe the rhythm carried the memory so deeply into the collective consciousness that words weren't even necessary. Griots didn't memorize words. In isolation, they memorized cadences, the rise and fall of syllables, the push and pull of phrases. Like a canoe moving with the river current, the rhythm didn't fight the memory, it guided it. Apprentices would spend months, sometimes years, just learning how to breathe properly during recitations. You'd think this would be easy. Breathing usually comes standard in most humans. But not griot breathing. No, this was controlled, crafted, and highly strategic. 1 beat, 2 beats, then the name. Then a turn of phrase, then another beat slightly faster now, as you move from grandfather to father to son, then the sudden staccato of battle, then the long-held silence of a tragic betrayal. And sometimes, just sometimes, a griot would use the eyebrow. Yes, that's right, the eyebrow. A subtle lift of the brow during a name. It meant, pay attention, this ancestor did something shady. A twitch during a proverb. This one might be a dig at someone in the audience. There are entire stories told in rhythm and face with very few words spoken at all. Griots were master puppeteers of human attention, and their rhythm extended beyond sound into gesture, breath, and the sacred pause. One griot, famously nicknamed the Pause Between Storms, once held a room in complete silence for 27 seconds mid-tale. No drum, no voice, just eyes. And when he finally whispered the next line, and then the ancestor spoke, grown men reportedly burst into tears. Of course, this level of precision wasn't easy. Griot training often included walking while reciting, keeping pace with steps, breath, and memory all aligned. If you stumbled, so did the story. And let me tell you, nothing earns a young griot more side-eye than accidentally giving a revered ancestor 2 wives instead of 3, simply because you tripped on a root. To help with all this, griots developed elaborate mnemonic chants. Think of them as internal cheat codes, repeated phrases that cued a longer passage. Some chants were whispered privately, others sung aloud as part of the performance. A line like, "Where the river bends, memory waits," might be a trigger for an entire family tree that begins near a real river bend, where according to legend someone once saw a fish wearing a necklace. Yes, that's a real story. No, we're not unpacking it now. There's also evidence that griots encoded memory into music modes. Certain melodies signaled different types of tales. One scale for heroic deeds, another for cautionary lessons, yet another for romantic tragedies involving millet traders and forbidden yams. Modern ethnomusicologists still puzzle over how griots used these tonal shifts. Some believe each key represented a dynasty. Others say the notes followed lunar cycles, agricultural rhythms, or simply the whims of whichever goat had recently disrupted the rehearsal. Either way, the system worked. It worked because it wasn't rigid. It breathed. The rhythm wasn't a cage, it was a path, one that led the griot through forests of forgetting, across deserts of distraction, and straight into the oasis of memory where everything was waiting alive, pulsing, and ready to be sung. So next time your memory fails you, when you can't find your keys, or recall the name of that neighbor who always smells faintly of soup, don't be too hard on yourself. You're not a griot. But maybe, just maybe, if you hum a little rhythm, close your eyes, and imagine a drum beat echoing across a moonlit village, the memory might return. And if it doesn't, well, blame the goat. It usually is the goat. Section 10. If rhythm was the griot's compass, then song was the ship they sailed in, bright, buoyant, occasionally full of holes, but always somehow arriving exactly where it needed to. Because what do you do when the secrets of your people are too sacred to shout, when invaders are near, or the king's in a mood, or the elders raise their eyebrows just a little too high? You sing it. You hide history in a song. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But this, dear listener, was one of the griot's most dazzling tricks. A song might sound like a lullaby, a wedding chant, a pleasant ditty about harvesting millet, but to those who knew, it was something else entirely. It was code, camouflage, a delivery system for truth, so elegant it made even the sharpest swords feel clumsy. You could be sitting next to a griot, nodding along as they strummed their kora and sang about the moon that weeps above the river, and miss entirely that the song was about a king's betrayal, a civil war, and an exiled queen whose name was now taboo. That's the magic of it. You only heard what you were ready to hear. Now let's be clear, this wasn't deception. It was discretion. It was tradition's version of whispering behind a fan, because sometimes survival meant saying everything without seeming to say anything at all. There's a story about a griot who once performed before a gathering of foreign dignitaries. The occasion was grand. There were torches, silks, awkwardly carved chairs that looked expensive but squeaked like frightened chickens. The griot sang a song so light, so cheerful, that even the most humorless scribe smiled. But the locals heard it differently. They caught the references to rivers that had run red, to harvests stolen by outsiders, to ancestors whose names were being erased. And they knew. They clapped with tears in their eyes, while the visitors just clapped politely and wondered why everyone looked so solemn. Historians still argue about that song. Some say it was protest, others healing. A few insist it was just about fish, but most agree it was powerful, because in the griot tradition, meaning was layered. The surface was for the crowd. The depth was for those who remembered. This method of concealment wasn't just musical. Griots were experts at embedding information into what looked like entertainment. A lullaby sung to a restless child might contain a family's origin story. A playful call and response game might trace a migration route. Even riddles had double meanings, one for fun, one for survival. One particularly sly griot was known for inventing songs about animals, each creature symbolizing a different clan. A crocodile might mean a warrior lineage. A parrot, the royal scribes. A tortoise, well, that was usually someone's cousin who made very slow decisions and married very late in life. These songs worked because they were catchy. Children sang them. Traders hummed them. No one thought too hard about the lyrics until suddenly a land dispute arose and someone realized the crocodile song contained all the details of an old agreement long forgotten, but now suddenly gloriously relevant. There was also a sense of protection. You see, if a griot told a story too plainly, it could be challenged, censored, or forgotten. But a song, a melody, it slipped through the cracks. It lived on in the mouths of the people, harder to silence, impossible to erase. And so griots sang. They sang in joy, in mourning, in warning, and always with layers. A single verse might praise a hero, mourn a mistake, and hint at a long unresolved feud, all in 12 measures and a minor key. Even the structure of songs mattered. Some were built in cycles rounds that returned again and again, echoing how memory itself works not in straight lines but in spirals. Others used call and response, engaging the audience, pulling them into the remembering process. If you'd ever been to one of these performances, you'd know how it felt, the thrill of realizing halfway through that you were part of the story now. And then there was silence. A griot might end a song, not with a final note, but with a pause, hanging, unfinished. It was an invitation, a challenge, a whisper that said, "You know how this ends." Don't you? Some songs were never written down. They lived only in the griot's voice, passed from mentor to student. A few, we believe, have been lost. Entirely tales carried off by wind forgotten when the last singer left no apprentice behind. But others survive, woven into newer songs, absorbed by popular music, whispered into modern instruments that still remember how to ache, because music remembers what paper forgets. And that's the heart of it. The griot's song was not just a performance, it was preservation, a vessel for truth, a melody you couldn't unhear, even if you didn't understand it the first time. So next time you hum a tune without knowing why it makes your chest ache, just a little pause. Listen again. There might be a griot hiding in the rhythm. Let's talk about feathers. Yes, feathers. Because when griots performed, they didn't just sing and chant and pound on drums. They dressed the part. They didn't stumble in, wearing yesterday's laundry and a sheepish expression. Oh no. A griot arrived like a walking museum, wrapped in layers of cloth that shimmered with stories, crowned in hats that whispered of past glories, and quite often tucked with a feather or two, just jaunty enough to make a point without actually having to say it aloud. And what was the point? I know things. But of course the griot couldn't say that. It would be far too obvious. So instead they let the feather speak. The jewelry jingle, the cloth swirl, subtle, not really, effective, absolutely. Feathers were often symbolic. A single white feather might signify a lineage traced back to spiritual intermediaries. A bright red one wore lineage. Peacock feathers, when available, were used by griots who, how to put this, delicately favored performance over precision. You know the type. All flair little fact-checking, but somehow still beloved by the crowd, probably because they rhymed yams with kingdom collapse and made it work. Clothing wasn't vanity, it was messaging. It was coded like everything else in the griot's toolkit. The folds in a sash might represent a family's branching history. A necklace of carved beads might reference every major chief a griot had ever performed for, and if arranged just so, serve as a polite reminder to pay him more than last time. But let's not pretend it was all dignity and decorum. Griots loved a bit of drama. They understood the power of theatrics, a sudden spin, a long, deliberate lean, a dramatic wiping of the brow at the mention of a particularly chaotic rain. Every motion, every fabric ripple had purpose. And then there was the flattery. Ah, yes, flattery. The griot's most versatile spice. It was said that a well-timed griot could inflate a chief's ego so thoroughly he'd forget he hadn't won a battle in 20 years. Your beard is like the river's wisdom, deep winding, slightly unpredictable. Your gaze is as steady as the sun before a storm. Your feet do not walk. The earth moves to meet them. Did it matter if any of it was true? Absolutely not. Flattery was a griot's grease. It opened doors, unlocked ears, and loosened purse strings. But it had to be done with finesse. Too much, and the griot risked looking like a court jester with delusions of poetry. Too little, and the crowd might wonder if the griot had forgotten how important they were. One griot famously balanced the act by using proverbial flattery. You'd think he was talking about a general's bravery, but really he was referencing a cunning rabbit. If the general was clever, he'd laugh. If not, well, more stew for everyone else. And yet amid all the showmanship and sparkle, the griot never lost sight of the facts, because beneath the dancing words and embroidered robes was a core of steel-hard memory. The griot knew. They remembered the real story. They remembered the names, the dates, the details. And if they smiled while calling you brave, it was only because they also remembered how you once ran screaming from a squirrel during the harvest festival. This created a delicate tension. Griots were adored, but also slightly feared. Revered, but occasionally resented. Because when you carry the weight of the past, you also carry people's secrets. And people don't always like having their history sung in public, especially when it includes awkward courtships, stolen goats, or that unfortunate incident involving fermented maize and a misjudged proverb. Historians still debate just how much of the griot's role was diplomacy. Were they simply performers, or were they mediators? Managing tensions between clans with the careful application of praise, gentle correction, and historical nudges? The answer, of course, is both. There's a wonderful tale of a griot who attended a political summit between rival villages. Tensions were high. The chiefs weren't speaking. The stew was underseasoned. So the griot stood up and began a song, not about politics, but about two ancient warriors who accidentally became best friends after chasing the same antelope for 3 days. By the time he finished, both chiefs were chuckling. A peace treaty was signed before the evening's yam mash was served. Subtle, very effective, incredibly. Because griots understood the layers. They knew how to stack truth, myth, metaphor, and melody into something that people didn't just hear, they felt. And once you feel a story, it's yours. You carry it forward. You pass it on. And that's where the real legacy lived. Not in the performance, but in the ripple. So the next time you dress up, speak sweetly, or tell a carefully softened version of the truth. Know that you are part of a long tradition. A tradition of feathers, flattery, and facts maybe. A tradition that understands sometimes the best way to say something serious is with a smile. Let's wander now into the crumbling grandeur of fallen empires, shall we? Because while griots were masters of memory and melody, their true genius revealed itself after the walls fell, when the banners had burned, when the scribes had scattered, when the rulers were now bones beneath the dust, and yet somehow the griot still spoke their name. It said that griots could keep a kingdom alive long after its final battle, not through rebuilding but through retelling. Empires may have crumbled, but if the griot remembered, really remembered, then some piece of it still breathed just barely in the rhythm of their voice. Take the Empire of Mali, for instance. In its time, Mali was vast, glorious, rich with gold, learned in letters ruled by kings, with names that sang Sundiata Mansa Musa kings, whose wealth blinded the markets of Cairo and whose caravans bent the horizon. But when the armies weakened and the maps were redrawn by foreigners with too much ink and not enough context, something peculiar happened. The griots didn't stop. They kept telling the story. Not just the rise, but the ruin. Not just the glory, but the cracks. They sang of the victories, yes, but also of the arrogance, the betrayals, the missed omens. They told of how the walls fell not from invasion alone, but from forgetting the kind that begins quietly, like termites under a throne, because to a griot, history wasn't just a celebration, it was a warning. Every fallen city was a tale wrapped in consequence. Every disgraced king was a verse added with a raised eyebrow, and just the slightest pause between syllables, letting the lesson hang in the air like dust after a stampede. There's a griot story about the collapse of the kingdom of Tekrur that ends not with a battle, but with an argument. Two cousins, both princes, feuded over who had the right to host a festival. The griot, watching from the shadows, recorded not just the facts but the tone. One prince mocked the other's singing voice. That allegedly was the final insult. Historians still argue about whether such a thing could truly lead to collapse. But in griot lore, absolutely. Because empires don't fall from single arrows, they fall from 1,000 small forgettings, a proverb ignored, a ritual rushed, a song left unsung. And so as the cities fell, the griots became archives on legs. They wandered, from ruined courts to dusty villages. They carried stories like relics, unpacking them when needed, folding them gently when not. They adapted. If they couldn't sing of kings, they sang of what was lost. If no one would pay them to recite the lineage, they embedded the lineage into love songs and fishing chants. Some griots even turned to satire. Oh yes, when nobility failed, humor rose. A griot without a patron is a dangerous thing. Unmoored, sharp-tongued, full of memory, and very few inhibitions. There are griot poems that describe entire dynasties through the metaphors of spoiled stew, broken sandals, and overly proud donkeys. One verse likened a fallen king to a drum that thunders loudly, yet cannot call the rain. It stung, but it stuck. This adaptability, this refusal to let memory die, was what kept the griot tradition alive when so much else vanished. Paper burned, temples collapsed, names were erased from stone, but the griot remembered, and memory became rebellion. During colonial occupations, griots played a quiet, potent role. Official histories were rewritten, maps redrawn, indigenous knowledge dismissed as myth. But the griots, they kept singing the old names. They reminded people that before the train tracks came, there were kingdoms. Before the schools with foreign alphabets, there were libraries of flesh and voice and bone. One French administrator reportedly tried to record a griot's performance, only to realize, after hours of chanting, that the griot had been reciting a resistance anthem so deeply veiled in metaphor no outsider could parse it. To the untrained ear, it was about fish migration. To the people, it was fire. Even today, in regions where griot traditions persist, they serve as cultural resurrectors. When a community begins to forget to drift to question who they are, it's the griots who step forward and say, "Let me remind you. Let me show you not just where you've been, but what you carry." Because that's the thing about memory. It doesn't just record, it revives. The griot didn't let fallen empires rot in silence. They turned them into lessons, into laments, into rhythms passed to children who would never see the golden cities but would still hear the gold in the song. And maybe that's the truest legacy of all. Not to be remembered with statues, but to be sung long after the stone has cracked. So the next time you hear a tune you can't quite place a rhythm that tugs at your bones, pause. It might be an old empire still breathing through the griot's gift. By now you may be thinking, surely the griots had it easy once colonizers showed up with notebooks and typewriters and slightly condescending mustaches. But no, my dear listener. That's where things got complicated. Because this is the chapter where the griot meets the Frenchman with a clipboard. Picture it a colonial officer in pressed khaki, sweating politely under the West African sun, asking a griot to kindly summarize 700 years of oral history into neat bullet points. The griot, resplendent in cloth older than the officer's country, offers a polite smile and proceeds to chant for 6 hours without pause, and none of it fits in the boxes. Colonial administrators, anthropologists, and early ethnographers were fascinated and frequently bewildered by griots. They wanted dates, names, events fixed and labeled. But griot history doesn't work like that. It's layered, poetic, unfolding in spirals, not timelines. A griot might start with the founding of a kingdom detour through a love triangle involving a blacksmith and a spirit reference, a proverb about stubborn camels. Then loop back to the original dynasty 2 hours later. The Frenchman scribbles furiously. The griot sips tamarind water. The records that resulted from these encounters were uneven. Some griots played along. They gave the colonial writers what they wanted: short versions, clean genealogies, a few nicely symmetrical stories. But others, more mischievous or simply more traditional, used the moment to protect the deeper truths. They gave surface tales. They edited strategically. After all, why hand over the sacred when the listener doesn't even know how to ask? There's one well-known story from Senegal of a griot who was asked by a European official to recount the region's political history. The griot nodded solemnly, launched into an epic, and according to later analysis, delivered the story entirely backwards, starting with the most recent events and slowly unraveling them toward the mythical beginning. The official published the account. Critics later described it as confusing but intriguing. Mission accomplished. See, the griots understood what the clipboard crew often didn't. Memory isn't always for sharing, at least not all of it. Some parts are earned, not given. You can't just copy it down. You have to live it. You have to grow up hearing it in the night, tasting it with your food, seeing it in the way your grandmother ties her head wrap, or how your uncle never walks past that tree without bowing just slightly. But the colonial impulse to fix knowledge, to write it down, file it, archive it, clashed deeply with the griots' fluid mastery of living memory. And so the griots resisted, not with swords, but with song, with the refusal to flatten their world into a foreign form. Some even found ways to hide stories in the official records, subtle changes in names, reversed metaphors, proverbial landmines buried in otherwise straightforward lists. A griot might list a king's victories with dramatic flourish, but then insert a single phrase he danced with heavy feet that any local would understand as a euphemism for cowardice. The Frenchman, none the wiser, would nod and note that the king was fond of dancing. There was also performance politics. Griots had to be careful. Too honest, and you risked punishment. Too flattering, and you lost respect. So they walked the same fine line they'd always walked, only now the audience was broader, more bureaucratic, and often poorly dressed for the climate. And still they endured. Because even as written records proliferated, even as colonial schools pushed French and Portuguese and English, the griots kept singing. In villages, at weddings under the night sky, they trained new apprentices. They whispered corrected histories to children behind schoolhouses. They sang the names that the textbooks left out. And eventually something surprising happened. People started listening again. Post-independence, when countries began reclaiming their pasts, who did they turn to? The griots. Suddenly the dusty recordings of their songs became national treasures. Their voices were sought for radio, for film, for literature. Historians, some sheepish, some triumphant, realized that the griots had preserved not just facts, but perspectives, emotional truth, cultural nuance, the things the official archives never captured. Because yes, a griot might say that a king ruled for 40 years, but they'd also tell you how he ruled, whether people laughed more or less, whether the rain came when it was supposed to, whether the land liked him. One scholar, after years of study, wrote that griot history is not a map. It's a weather pattern. You don't navigate it so much as live in it, feel it change, let it soak into your skin, and maybe that's the lesson. That not all truth needs to be dissected, cataloged, and pinned like a butterfly on paper. Some truths need to be sung. Some need to be difficult. Some need to be carried in your breath, your bones, your silences. So the next time someone asks you to summarize your life, try answering like a griot. Start with your great-grandmother's favorite proverb. Detour through the time your uncle wrestled a goose at a funeral. Mention the smell of rain on the day you first felt truly brave. Then add a drum beat. If they get confused, smile kindly. Not everyone is meant to understand the whole song. And now, friends, we come to a most delicate tale, a tale involving diplomacy, drama, and the kind of wedding you only recover from 3 years later with therapy and fermented honey. Let us now speak of bride prices, drum beats, and one particularly infamous diplomatic disaster that still gets whispered about over lukewarm stew in certain corners of West Africa. Picture a village under a wide cloudless sky. Preparations for a grand wedding are underway. Mats are laid out. Elders are assembling. Children are being told to behave, with wildly varying results. And a goat, because there's always a goat, is tied a little too close to the ceremonial drums. This was no ordinary wedding. This was a union between two powerful families, each claiming descent from lines so long that griots were still trying to find the bottom of them. The bride was said to be wise beyond her years, the groom. Let's just say he had good sandals and leave it at that. Everything was ready. until the griot stood to speak. Now the griot's role at weddings wasn't just decorative. He was the living ledger of honor, lineage, and land. His recitation of family histories wasn't a prelude, it was the contract. If the names aligned, if the ancestors smiled, the marriage would be blessed. If not, well, stew could curdle. And that day, oh, that fateful day, the griot forgot a goat. More specifically, he forgot to mention a goat that had been given as part of a dowry exchange 3 generations ago. A goat so famously stubborn that its memory had outlived several humans. It had, according to legend, once charged a rain priest, ruined a ceremonial drum skin, and survived 3 attempts at ritual sacrifice, simply by bleeding so pitifully no one could follow through. Leaving this goat out of the record was no small error. Within moments, murmurs rippled through the crowd like a brush fire. An elder on the bride's side turned visibly purple. The groom's uncle began gesturing furiously. Someone dropped a calabash of palm wine, and the goat, perhaps sensing its moment, bleated once dramatically. What followed was chaos. The bride's family accused the groom's side of trying to erase their contribution. The groom's family insisted it was a simple mistake. The griot attempted to correct himself mid-verse, but once the rhythm breaks, so does the piece. One uncle stormed off. A cousin fainted into the yam pile. The goat, finally unrestrained, headbutted the wedding drum and sat on it. Historians still argue whether the wedding was ever completed. Some say it was rescheduled. Others claim it turned into a wrestling match that ended in an unexpected second marriage. A few maintain that the bride married the griot out of spite, though this seems logistically unlikely. But one thing is certain, the griot never forgot a goat again, and this was not an isolated incident. Griots walked a tightrope at every ceremonial event. Ceremonial weddings, funerals, name-givings, reconciliations. They were required to perform flawlessly, to recite history in such a way that every family felt honored, every ancestor acknowledged, every long-standing feud artfully sidestepped. A wrong word could reignite an ancient quarrel. A missing name might undo a land agreement sealed with nothing more than a proverb and a handshake. To manage this, griots developed entire subgenres of diplomatic storytelling. They used vague metaphors, ambiguous pronouns, and most impressively, equal opportunity flattery. If a bride's grandfather was known more for his flirtations than his harvest yields, the griot might say, "He sowed many seeds across many fields, and his laughter was known even in distant towns." If a groom's mother had once accidentally sold an entire shipment of dried fish to the wrong village, the griot might quip. She was a woman of vision who believed that every river led somewhere useful. These weren't lies. They were strategic truths. Still, there were risks. The more political the union, the more tense the performance. Griots sometimes consulted with both families beforehand, conducting what can only be described as historical negotiations over bowls of stew and whispered side chats behind storage huts. And even then they could get caught. One griot, desperate to avoid offending anyone, tried to blend 2 conflicting versions of a family's ancestry into a single poetic chant. It began well. The rhythm flowed, the metaphors sparkled. But then he accidentally married the bride's great-uncle to a mythical river spirit who, in a separate tale, had cursed the groom's family's livestock. Tense silence. A collective inhale. One elderly woman dropped her spoon. Thankfully, a drummer improvised a distracting beat, and the griot switched topics so fast it gave the goat whiplash. The incident was never officially acknowledged, though it said the bride's father developed an odd fear of lakes for the rest of his life. These tales illustrate not just the danger of forgetting, but the art of remembering selectively. Griots knew how to preserve dignity while navigating tangled histories. They knew when to quote exactly and when to wink metaphorically. They were in many ways the first and finest PR agents. And they had to be, because in the absence of written contracts, their words were the law. Their rhythm was the signature. Their voice the binding agreement. So should you ever find yourself invited to a wedding presided over by a griot, be respectful. Sit close. Listen well. And whatever you do, don't interrupt. Don't question a name mid-verse. Don't correct a date out loud. And please double check the goat count before the ceremony begins. Let us now speak of a sacred rule whispered under breath and etched into the hearts of those who knew. You do not interrupt a griot, ever. Not during a recitation, not during a song, not even if the sky splits open and 3 goats form a conga line in the courtyard. The griot's word is a current. Once flowing, it cannot be stopped without dire consequence. Or at the very least, a strongly worded proverb from a grandmother who's seen more than one hot-headed youth humbled by a verse too sharp for public consumption. The reason for this rule isn't just about manners, it's about risk. Because a griot in full flow is not merely telling a story. They are invoking, summoning memory, stirring the dust of ancestors. And if you interrupt that, you don't just break the rhythm, you unravel the thread tying the past to the present. In some traditions, it's said that interrupting a griot mid-line brings bad harvest. In others, it causes the spirits of forgotten kings to pace around at night, knocking over pots and whispering names that should have stayed buried. Whether these are metaphors or actual village events is still debated, often over mildly fermented millet beverages and very serious expressions. There's one infamous tale of a young man, a trader's son, fresh with pride and too many bracelets, who dared to correct a griot during a village gathering. The griot had perhaps, intentionally perhaps not, said that the young man's grandfather once lost a wrestling match to a woman in the middle of market day. The young man jumped up, puffed out his chest, and declared, "That is not true." The griot paused, ever so slightly, then slowly turned to face him. "Oh," he said with a smile like a knife sliding into warm butter. "Then let us discuss what is true." And for the next 20 minutes, the griot told the entire story. Not just the wrestling match, but the failed business venture that followed. The lost dowry. The nickname that spread to 5 villages, the one who rolled sideways. By the end, the young man had quietly sunk to the back row, bracelets tucked under his arms, eyes fixed on his sandals. The crowd, meanwhile, was thrilled. See, griots don't need volume to dominate a room. They have the weight of truth. And truth, when spoken in rhythm and memory and just the right tone of voice, is heavier than any insult. But here's the twist. The no interruption rule wasn't just about fear. It was about trust. The community trusted the griot to get it right. Even when it was uncomfortable. Even when the truth stung a bit like stepping on a thorn while trying to look dignified. Because the griot didn't speak for people. They spoke to them. With the authority of history, yes, but also the affection of someone who had carried these stories long before anyone in the room was born. And besides, the griots didn't just remember the mistakes. They remembered the greatness too. The warrior who stood alone against raiders and lived. The grandmother who fed a starving village through clever planting and even cleverer negotiation. The child who sang an entire genealogy at the age of 6 and was promptly gifted a small goat and an enormous sense of self-worth. These moments, these threads of glory were preserved, honored, cherished, and interrupting them, that was not just rude, it was dangerous. You risked fraying the very fabric of what held the community together. There were also subtle social cues involved. If someone needed correcting, it would be done after the story, never in the moment, never in the heat of the chant. It said that the worst punishment wasn't being called out, it was being ignored by the griot completely. To be forgotten, to be passed over in the recitation, was to be erased from communal memory, which in a world without archives was a fate worse than exile. Historians have marveled at this cultural mechanism, how oral societies manage to maintain order, hierarchy, and dignity through performance. But to griots, it wasn't surprising at all. It was simply how things were done. There's even evidence of ritual silence during griot performances. Certain elders would strike a pose, head bowed, eyes closed, creating a physical stillness that told the youth, this is not the time for your opinions. This is the time for listening. Of course, this wasn't about silencing dissent forever. Griots often invited discussion after. When the story had been fully told, when the final chord had faded, then came the questions, the reflections, the polite debates over whether Great Uncle Samba really did eat that many mangoes before the duel, but never during. Even today, echoes of this tradition survive. In ceremonies, in speeches, in family gatherings where the eldest aunt tells a tale and no one dares reach for their phone until she's done. Because we still understand somewhere deep inside that stories require space. That memory deserves a stage. And so, let this be a gentle warning to the bold, the brash, the easily bored. When a griot speaks, do not interrupt. Sit still, let the story unfold, and if you must correct something, do it later, preferably while offering a peace offering of stew and an apologetic proverb or two, because trust me, the griot will remember, and next time you will be the story. Now then let us cast aside for a moment the dusty assumption that all griots were wizened men with deep voices and suspiciously dramatic cloaks. It's time, long past time, in fact, to speak of the women, the Jelimusau, the griotesses. Yes, you heard right, because not all the keepers of memory, singers of praise, or weaponized wielders of family secrets were men. Some of the most formidable griots to ever chant a lineage or obliterate an ego with a proverb wore headscarves, had sharp eyes, and took precisely zero nonsense from any one king, cousin, or cranky goat. In many West African traditions, particularly among the Mande, the role of griot was as much a family trade as it was a profession, and women born into griot families weren't told to hush and fetch water while their brothers learned the drum rhythms. No, they learned too. Often earlier, often faster. You see, the Jelimusau had a power all their own. While the men might recite at court, the women sang at ceremonies, at weddings, at naming festivals, places where emotions were high and the stakes were personal. These weren't performances for political theater. These were the moments where memory mattered most, when babies were welcomed into the world with ancestral songs, when a bride was praised into womanhood with verses so potent they made her in-laws weep. One such Jelimusau, her name now half swallowed by time, was known to stop arguments simply by beginning to hum. Not chant, not shout, just hum, and the crowd would still, as if the ancestors themselves had paused to listen. It wasn't magic, it was reputation. She had, after all, once ended a 3-village feud by composing a single satirical ballad that referenced a very unfortunate haircut worn by a particularly prideful nobleman. He reportedly retreated into his home for a week and emerged with a hat he never again removed. And yet for centuries, the contributions of female griots were overlooked by outsiders. Early European visitors scribbling in their little leather journals often wrote about the griot singular male dramatic. They missed the women entirely. Or worse, they saw them as background performers. Decorative, maybe. Incidental. But ask the villagers, they remember. They remember the auntie whose voice cracked open the sky during funerals, the grandmother who could recite the clan's lineage backward while folding laundry and scolding chickens, the young girl who during a drought sang the rain back, or at least convinced everyone it was coming, which in times of crisis is almost the same thing. These women carried memory not with bombast, but with presence. Their words didn't need volume. They carried weight in the way a grandmother's silence can feel louder than thunder. And they wielded emotion that most potent of mnemonic tools with surgical precision. A Jellimasow's song could lift you to pride or reduce you to a puddle of familial regret in less than 3 verses. Because while male griots might perform epics of statecraft and conquest, the women remembered the people, the real people, who loved whom, who left, who came back, who shouldn't have. They preserved intimacy, and let us not pretend they lacked poetic teeth. Far from it. One legendary Jellimasow, when insulted by a rival clan during a wedding, replied not with anger, but with a lullaby, so layered in shade and irony that the children clapped along entirely unaware their uncles were being roasted alive in metaphor. To this day, the song survives, but the rival clan's pride? Not so much. And the instruments? Oh, they played. Balafons chorus, sometimes even calabashes turned upside down and tapped with elegance. Some used only their voice ornamented with ululations that danced over the crowd like wind through millet fields. The sound was not always beautiful in the Western sense, but it was true, which in the griot world is far more valuable. There were even traveling troops of Jellimasow sisterhoods of song who moved from town to town singing the stories that others feared to tell. They collected truths like beads, stringing them into melodies that could make a man smile or flinch, depending on what he'd been up to lately. And they trained others, passed it down. Matrilineal wisdom, not always in public, but always with intention. There are stories of girls learning rhythm on the soles of their feet, taught to feel the beat of history by stamping to the sound of their mother's voice. Story as lullaby, history as inheritance. So the next time you imagine a griot standing beneath a baobab tree, don't just see a man with a drum. See a woman too, head high, voice steady, eyes watching everything. Because while the griots carried kingdoms in their mouths, the Jellimasow carried souls, and did so while running households, braiding hair, delivering babies, and occasionally settling a 3-generation dispute with one perfectly timed verse and a look that could peel paint. They were memory, they are memory, and may we never forget the ones who never let us forget. Let's turn now to the instruments, the tools of the trade. Not the feathered hats, not the scented oils, or the ceremonial stew ladles, though all played their parts in the great theater of memory, but the real gear, the strings, the sand, and the syllables that gave shape to the griot's art. Because let's be honest, even the best memory needs a bit of scaffolding. First up, the kora, perhaps the most iconic instrument in the griot's arsenal. a 21-stringed wonder that looks like someone tried to turn a calabash into a harp and accidentally created magic. Played with thumbs and index fingers, the kora sings with the lightness of water and the depth of morning. In griot hands, it was more than accompaniment, it was memory's melody. Each string could represent a different dynasty, a different season, a different mood. A descending pattern might recall a fall from power, a sharp arpeggio, a sudden betrayal. A griot might not even need to speak the words. Just pluck a certain chord, and the elders in the room would know exactly which scandal was being referenced. Eyebrows would rise. Stew spoons would pause mid-air. It's been said that a griot and their kora were so connected, they didn't play it, they conversed with it. Like an old friend who remembers all your secrets and occasionally volunteers them to the entire village if you've forgotten your manners. But not every griot used a kora. There was the balafon too, an instrument of wooden keys stretched over calabash resonators, producing a sound like laughter trapped in sunlight. Joyous, quick, layered. If the kora was for reflection, the balafon was for storytelling on the move. It galloped, it teased, it explained family drama with rhythm alone. Then there was the talking drum or tama, a little hourglass of power. It could mimic speech patterns when squeezed and struck just right, and griots used it to speak without speaking. A beat could say, "The king is arriving," or "The griot is displeased," or "The goat has eaten the ceremonial cloth again." It all depended on tone, tempo, and which side of the village had misbehaved recently. But not all tools made music. Sometimes the griot's tools were simpler, like sand. Yes, sand. There are stories of griots smoothing patches of earth with their palms and tracing lineage lines with a fingertip, using curves and dots to represent generations, marriages, migrations. The sand was wiped clean at the end, of course, but for those few minutes it was a scroll, a living record that danced in the breeze and vanished like breath. And then came the syllables. Griots didn't just remember names, they remembered how to say them, where to stress the vowel, when to pause, how to pronounce a consonant so it evoked pride or caution or perhaps a memory of that time. An ancestor dramatically fell into a canoe mid-proposal. These syllables mattered. Saying a name wrong wasn't just a misstep, it was a misfire. A name carried identity, honor, history. Mispronouncing it was like calling someone's grandmother a chicken without feathers. Unforgivable, possibly duel worthy. Definitely stew withholding worthy. To help apprentices master this, griots used call and response drills. The teacher would chant a line and the student would repeat it over and over until the syllables slipped into the bones. Sometimes the teacher would change the rhythm slightly, forcing the apprentice to adjust, to listen harder. It wasn't just about remembering. It was about understanding what memory sounds like. There's one charming, mildly terrifying account of a griot school where students were woken before dawn by a sudden drum beat and required to begin reciting lineage verses before breakfast. If they hesitated, they got more verses. If they performed flawlessly, they got breakfast and a smug smile from the instructor. Motivation, you see, takes many forms. And even more subtle than the syllables were the vocal gestures, the sighs, the lilts, the sudden hush. A griot might lower their voice at the mention of a fallen hero or raise it into falsetto to mimic a long-dead matriarch who once yelled so loudly she ended a tax dispute. These weren't gimmicks. They were part of the record, emotion embedded in sound. Historians often overlook this. They analyze griot texts, if transcribed, but miss the music, the exact timbre that made a name sacred or scandalous or softly mourned. Memory for the griot wasn't just stored, it was performed. And the instruments were not passive. They shaped the telling. And there were rules. A song played on the kora might only be performed during the dry season. A certain balafon pattern might be reserved for funerals. A phrase once spoken required a specific drum rhythm to seal it. It was a system complex, intuitive, and so seamlessly integrated into the griot's daily life that it didn't feel like a system at all. Just breath, just song, just truth and rhythm. So if you're ever tempted to think of griots as mere storytellers with a good memory, remember this. They were orchestras in human form. Their tools weren't stored in cases, they were worn, played, breathed. They didn't just recall history, they performed the memory of a people. If there's one thing griots knew better than anyone, aside from how to unravel a family secret using only a drum beat and a raised eyebrow, it was this: people love a good duel. Not with swords, no, or even with words sharp enough to slice through a cassava root. No, this was something much finer, more refined, more ridiculous. We speak now of the dueling griots of the Moon Festival. Yes, it happened. Often. You see, while most of the time griots worked to preserve harmony, settling disputes, soothing tempers, reminding people that their great-grandmother once helped that family during a flood, and so maybe you should put down the spear sometimes. Sometimes they were encouraged to do the opposite, for fun, for competition, for the sheer thrill of watching two walking encyclopedias square off in poetic combat. It was part spectacle, part history lesson, part low-key therapy for entire villages. The rules flexible, the audience very engaged, the stakes usually just pride, but occasionally the last gourd of decent honey beer. At the Moon Festival, when the air turned sweet and the night stretched long, it was traditional in certain regions, particularly in parts of the Mande and Wolof territories, for two griots to take the center of the village and begin a contest of memory and wit. One griot would begin with a story, usually something grand, sweeping, and filled with glorious ancestors. The other would respond with a correction, a counter story, or more often a dramatic elaboration that turned the original tale on its head. And it escalated from there. Your ancestor may have planted the sacred tree, one griot would declare, but mine taught the tree how to sway properly. In the wind? Oh, really, the other would reply, eyes gleaming. Then perhaps you'd like to explain why your lineage is known in 4 villages as the ones who once lost a goat to a fish. Laughter, gasps, occasional goat-related sound effects. The beauty of these duels was that they operated on layers. At the surface, they were playful, funny, almost absurd. But underneath, they were reinforcing history, reciting lineage-testing details, invoking moments the crowd may have forgotten. And the crowd didn't just watch passively. They participated. Cheers, claps, the occasional good-natured heckle when someone bent the story too far toward fantasy. Sometimes the griots rhymed. Sometimes they sang. Sometimes they would clap rhythmically, drawing out pauses, letting anticipation build like thunder before a storm. And sometimes they'd draw the crowd into call and response. A clever griot could get half the village chanting a proverb that doubled as a jab at the other griot's pronunciation of a key ancestor's name. It was, in short, a masterclass in performance memory and low-stakes ancestral roasting. Historians still argue whether these duels were rehearsed or truly improvised, Some suspect griots prepared in advance, especially when their rival was well known. But others believe the truest magic came from spontaneity, from the griot's ability to pull an obscure detail from 5 generations back and deploy it like a well-aimed spear dipped in sweet sarcasm. There's one tale, half legend, half likely true, of 2 griots so evenly matched that their duel lasted 3 days. Day 1 was family histories. Day 2 was community contributions, complete with a bit of light bribery from the crowd. Day 3 was culinary legacies. Yes, they argued over whose ancestor invented a particular type of spiced yam dish. The winner, unclear. The result, a new proverb. Never argue over stew unless you brought a spoon, unless you think it was all just fun, and games these duels served a vital purpose. They tested the griots. They ensured that no one grew lazy with their knowledge. That pride didn't dull the edges of truth. That memory stayed alive not just through reverence, but through joyful challenge. It also helped to lighten the load. Because let's be honest, carrying centuries of history on your tongue can get heavy. Griots bore witness to births, deaths, betrayals, and buried truths. They held memories that still stung. So sometimes a little laughter, a little ridiculousness, was not just welcome but necessary. And the best griots, they knew how to wield it. They knew how to make the serious playful, the painful poetic, the past a playground without ever becoming disrespectful. That's a delicate skill, turning a battle over who once owned a particularly dramatic chicken into a lesson about inheritance law, turning a rhyme about a crooked hut into a reflection on architectural collapse and political failure, and all while keeping the audience spellbound, the drums steady, and the goats from chewing on the ceremonial grass mats. And then, when it was over, when both griots bowed and shook hands, or more often traded compliments disguised as insults, the crowd would erupt in applause and the elders would nod, because they knew this wasn't just performance, it was memory maintenance. It was the griot's way of oiling the gears of history, of airing out the past, of letting it breathe, laugh, stumble, and get back up again. So the next time someone tells you history has to be serious, dry, solemn, tell them about the Moon Festival. Tell them about 2 griots yelling over whose great-grandmother made the best pickled fish. Tell them about joy as a vessel for truth. Because the past, like people, sometimes needs to laugh to survive. Not every story was meant to be told. There, I've said it. Even the griots, keepers of memory, champions of lineage, celebrants of the unspeakable beauty and occasional ridiculousness of human life, had their limits. Not every tale could be recited beneath the baobab tree. Not every truth was ready to be sung with a chora's shimmering chords or hammered into rhythm on a balafon. Some stories wanted to stay forgotten, but every griot eventually came across one such tale, a story so heavy, so tangled, so soaked in sorrow or shame or scandal that it sat in the memory like a stone in the stew pot. You couldn't eat around it. You just had to know it was there. And on rare nights, very rare indeed, one of these stories would escape. It might begin innocently enough. A gathering perhaps smaller than usual, the fire lower, the air still, the drums quiet or absent altogether. And then after a long silence, the griot might say, "There is a tale I have not told, one that doesn't like to be heard, but tonight, perhaps it's time." You could hear a mosquito blink. Now, I won't claim to know exactly which stories these were, but I can tell you the shapes of them. A feud that led to exile, a war fought for the wrong reason, a revered ancestor who may not have been as noble as remembered, or a betrayal so complete it unraveled a clan like an old woven mat, quietly and all at once. One such tale, almost certainly embellished by now, tells of a griot who carried a particular story for years. A story about a chief's brother, a hidden child, and a theft so bold it changed the course of an entire village's identity. He was warned not to tell it. The elder said, "Not this one." His mentor said, "Let it sleep." But the griot, growing old, grew restless, and one day, perhaps moved by dreams, perhaps by stew, spiced a bit too heavily, he began to tell it, slowly, hesitantly, as if the words might pull back into his throat. And as he spoke, strange things happened. The fire flickered even though there was no wind. A dog began to howl from beyond the compound. A child burst into tears, though no one had spoken her name. He finished the tale. He waited. No one clapped. And the next day the griot fell ill. Nothing dramatic. No lightning bolts or curses carved into the soil. Just a slow fade. A dimming. He grew quiet. He sang no more. And a week later he died in his sleep. Peaceful but gone, the villagers whispered. Some said he had broken a taboo. Others said he had merely fulfilled his duty carrying the truth as far as he could before handing it back to the silence. His apprentice, it said, never recited that story again. Historians hear these tales and debate furiously. Were these just superstitions? Socially enforced silences? Accidental metaphors stretched into legend, all possible? But griots understood something deeper. They knew that stories had seasons, that a truth, no matter how accurate, needed timing, the right ears, the right rhythm, the right stew simmering in the background. Some stories were like wild animals approach them wrong and they bite. Others were like ghosts tell them and they never leave. Still, there were those griots who could not resist. The lure of the forbidden story is strong, and so now and then a version would slip through, veiled in metaphor, couched in parable, wrapped so tightly in symbolism that only 3 people in the audience would understand it, and those 3 would go very, very quiet. A griot might say, "There was a village where no birds sang because once a man there tried to teach the wind how to lie." You'd think it was nonsense, but to the right ears, it meant everything. To the griots, these stories were part of the burden. They didn't relish them, they didn't seek them out, but they carried them because memory isn't just praise songs and noble ancestors. It's also mistakes, regrets, truths no one wants but someone must keep. One griot was asked once why he didn't sing a certain tale anymore. He paused and said, "Because I'm not ready for what will come after the song." And that, friends, is the difference between information and wisdom. The griots didn't just know, they felt, they waited. They listened for when the time was right. And sometimes it never was. So the next time someone insists on digging up the past, ask them first, is this a story you want to carry? Or one that's still deciding if it wants to be known? And if you're lucky and the fire's low and the wind isn't listening, you might just hear a griot begin a tale they promised never to tell. Just once. Quietly. And only for those who can bear it. And so we come to the end, not just of this story, but of many stories. Not because they've been forgotten, no, but because they've been passed on, whispered, sung, hummed, chanted, argued over, danced to, and occasionally disguised as lullabies about yams, The griots, those living libraries, those walking symphonies of truth and tact, knew that their greatest achievement was not in remembering everything, but in ensuring that someone else would remember too. Tonight we sit with one of them. He's old now. The griot, older than most of the baobabs in the village. His voice is dry but not brittle soft, but still edged with authority. Children gather close, not because he calls them, but because his silence invites them. He doesn't perform anymore, not like he used to. But sometimes on nights like this, he speaks. And when he does, he speaks like a breeze shifting through dry leaves. Quiet, reluctant, but powerful in that way of things that know their time has passed, but still have something to teach. He remembers when writing came, not just letters on a page, but the slow uncoiling of a new way of knowing. Schools were built, textbooks arrived. Young people were taught to trace their knowledge in ink, not in memory. And the griots, they watched. Some were angry, some were curious. Most were just wary, because they had seen what forgetting looked like. It didn't happen all at once. It started with small silences, a name skipped, a proverb shortened, a wedding with no song. Then came the shame. Children who spoke the old language only in secret. Elders who stopped correcting the mistakes in family stories because no one listens anymore. Young griots with no apprentices. The griot saw all this, and one day he walked out beneath the tree, the same tree where his teacher had once scolded him for missing a date in a lineage recitation, and he began to speak, slowly, clearly, into a microphone, into a recorder, into the waiting silence of a new kind of memory. He didn't love it, but he understood it, because the griot's task was never to cling to the past, it was to carry it forward. And so he told the stories again, some for the last time, some for the first. He told them to scholars, to children, to radios, to old cassette tapes now crackling in dusty drawers. He whispered names into digital archives. He taught a young woman how to pronounce a dynasty's founder's name exactly right, even though it made her tongue ache. He adapted, just like his teacher once had, just like the griot before him, because memory doesn't live in the past. It lives in the telling. And when he could speak no more, he simply sat, not in silence, but in presence. And the stories lived in those who had heard. Even now, even as the world spins faster, even as the noise of modernity rises, there are children learning the old rhythms. Not many, not always in the village, sometimes in cities, sometimes online, but learning. And the old griot, he doesn't worry, not really, because once a story has been sung, truly sung, it never really dies. It lingers in lullabies, in laughter, in those moments when someone begins a sentence with, "Well, my grandmother once said." That's the griot still speaking, still guiding, still remembering. And maybe, just maybe, you'll carry a little of it with you too. The fire's low now. Only embers remain, glowing soft, like ancient stars in a sky of soot and ash. The village sleeps, tucked beneath a blanket of night noises, frogs, clicking from the riverbank wind, brushing gently through the grass, a single owl keeping watch. Even the goats at last are still. The old stool is empty. The kora rests in its cloth. The drums are quiet, but the stories remain, drifting like smoke through the dark. You've heard them now? Let them settle. Let them fold into the quiet corners of your thoughts. No need to remember every name. No need to untangle every proverb. Just rest in the knowing that someone somewhere remembered for you. That someone sang the world into memory. and that it's enough. Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.